Drop the weapon and put...
Rifles. They're the preferred choice of SWAT teams. Usually, the suspects they encounter aren't heavily armed, so a smaller caliber weapon like an AR-15 is more than sufficient for the job. But when the threats get tougher, the rifles get bigger.
Police! Drop the weapon! Stop! Do it now!
Tread down.
Suspect down!
This is Doc.
Brought to you by Void Interactive. In the newest update to Ready or Not, 4 rifles are being added. They're all unique in origin, form, and design, but they all share one important characteristic. They're chambered in 7.62x51. As a whole, professional organizations that use rifles are moving towards smaller and lighter rounds, known as intermediate cartridges. But this wasn't always the case. For a long time, military doctrine towards firearms was simple. The bigger the bullet, the better. And for that purpose, full-size rifle cartridges like the 7.62x51 round were used. In a military context, the rifles that use these larger cartridges are called battle rifles. Law enforcement is somewhat of a different story. The main operational difference between military and law enforcement is that police primarily operate among civilian populations. With larger calibers, overpenetration is a real risk. A round going through a target and hitting something the shooter didn't intend to hit can have serious consequences. For that reason, law enforcement agencies generally avoid higher caliber cartridges, and they will almost never use such a rifle as an entry weapon. But like everything in life, there are exceptions. There are 3 main use cases for a 7.62x51 rifle in policing. The first has to do with penetration. While penetration is generally a downside in policing, there are scenarios in which it can be an advantage. One scenario where a battle rifle can be useful is when dealing with a barricaded suspect. When a suspect is holed up in a location that's dangerous to enter, a larger caliber can be useful in penetrating through cover. In theory, this enables an officer to take down a suspect without entering the room, though this would likely be a last resort. Firing rounds into a room you can't see into is incredibly unsafe. Another scenario for a battle rifle in policing is when dealing with body armor. While still relatively uncommon, there are criminals who have used body armor to great effect. In these circumstances, a larger round like 7.62x51 will do a better job of penetrating body armor compared to smaller calibers. Beyond a battle rifle's ability to penetrate through layers, 2 other use cases exist for their use in law enforcement. 7.62x51 in policing is handy when dealing with wildlife. In some rural jurisdictions, the presence of large aggressive wildlife can be a problem that police are responsible for handling. When dealing with predators such as bears, a larger caliber is necessary to humanely and quickly dispatch these animals. But most practically, a 7.62x51 rifle's most useful and common place in law enforcement is in the hands of police snipers. It may seem like overkill, but police snipers are an essential part of SWAT operations. Like military snipers, their primary objective is to relay information. Being at a safe distance to observe a situation unfold is essential in a high-risk scenario. SWAT snipers require very accurate firearms. While they're not making shots nearly as far as their military counterparts, they may have to make shots that require perfect precision, such as during a hostage rescue. In these situations, missing is unacceptable. They may also need to make shots through obstacles to hit their target, like a window. For both these reasons, a larger caliber like 7.62x51 works better, since they provide more penetrating power and are accurate to further distances. So while not the primary choice for law enforcement, 7.62x51 does have its place in policing. In this new DLC, you'll have access to 4 new battle rifles: the M14, HKG3, HK51, and Scar Heavy. Let's take a look at these new rifles, starting with the M14. During World War II, an enormous amount of different rifles were fielded, but when the dust settled, there was one rifle that was clearly superior to the others: the M1 Garand. It was revolutionary for the time, firing from an 8-round clip in semi-auto. However, while its performance during the war was exceptional, there was room for improvement. So, the Americans designed a new rifle meant to take the best features of the M1 Garand, while also implementing new capability into the weapon. This new rifle was the M14. The M14 was a rifle made for combat. A design intended as an upgrade for the battle-hardened M1 Garand, the rifle maintains the classic wooden stock, while adding a 20-round detachable magazine and full auto setting. Hopes were high for this weapon. In fact, the M14 was intended to replace not 1, not 2, but 4 military service weapons. So in 1957, the M14 was officially adopted as America's service weapon. But in practice, the M14's performance in combat was lackluster. The M14 was heavy, the wood stock swelled in the heat of the jungle, and the full auto setting useless. As a result, mass production of the M14 was stopped, and it was phased out as an infantry rifle in 1967. Nowadays, the M14 in the American military mainly sees use as a sniper rifle, with a significant number being converted into M21 sniper rifles. In that role, weight is less of a detractor, and the M14 can be tuned to become a very accurate weapon. So, that was the fate of many M14s in military service. But not all of them stayed within the military. Some are used in ceremonial roles, while others were exported to foreign countries. But most interestingly, a number of surplus military M14s found their way into the hands of American law enforcement agencies. Much like their military counterparts, M14s in law enforcement agencies are typically utilized as sniper rifles. When tuned properly, they are incredibly precise and accurate. So in the hands of a police sniper, the M14 is certainly a formidable weapon, ready to protect when needed. In Ready or Not, the M14 you'll have access to technically isn't an M14, but rather a variant known as the SOCOM 16. Introduced in 2004 by Springfield Armory, the SOCOM 16 is meant to be a lighter and shorter version of the M14. It achieves this by having a shorter 16-inch barrel and polymer stock, and also has a special muzzle brake at the end that helps reduce recoil, though this also makes the gun incredibly loud. If that bothers you, switch it out for the suppressor. The SOCOM 16 also has a top rail that will let you mount optics, lights, and lasers, though you won't be able to attach a foregrip. The shorter length makes the gun easier to use in CQB, and the heavy-hitting 7.62x51 means you'll take down any armored suspect with no issue. And just like its real counterpart, it's recommended to keep the gun on semi. While impressive, full auto is more of a liability than it is useful. If you do that, the SOCOM 16 will serve you very well in Ready or Not. So, the M14 was the American approach to a battle rifle, but other countries had different ideas on how to create a heavy-hitting fighting rifle. On the other side of battle lines in World War II, German weapons engineers had created a number of innovative and reliable firearms. And while part of Germany's surrender after World War II stipulated that they undergo rapid demilitarization, there were those that wanted to ensure those same German engineers continued their craft. With the formation of the Bundeswehr in 1955, and with the ever-growing threat of the Soviet Union, there was an immediate need to arm these soldiers. But there was one caveat. This new rifle needed to be chambered in 7.62x51 to be compliant with NATO standards. Initially, the Bundeswehr planned to go with the Belgian FNFAL, but could not obtain the license to produce the rifle domestically. So, other options were needed. While this was happening, some of these German engineers had moved to Spain, having been recruited by the Spanish firearm company SETMI. Their project was a unique semi-auto rifle design, a roller-delayed blowback rifle. The Bundeswehr was interested. They purchased a number of Setme's rifle, and ultimately chose it as their service weapon. This rifle was eventually named the Gewehr III, and unlike the FAL, West Germany was able to obtain a production license, which eventually became the sole responsibility of the German firearm company Heckler & Koch. Hence, the H&K G3. But what exactly makes the G3 so special? The G3 uses a roller-delayed blowback system. This is a fairly unique operating system in a semi-auto rifle. When a round is fired, a set of rollers hold the bolt in place for a fraction of a second, delaying the cycling of the bolt. This is a simple system that makes the weapon lightweight and reliable, though it also tends to get dirtier quicker. The G3 seen in Ready or Not is the G3A3. This is the most prolific and popular version of the rifle, with an improved front sight and muzzle device that can fire NATO standard grenades. But while it was a modern rifle for its time, it didn't come with any way to mount modern attachments, like optics, lights, and lasers. The version in Ready or Not comes with an aftermarket rail, so you can mount these modern options as you see fit. The G3 hits hard, but almost as violent is the kickback into the operator's shoulder. Just like its real counterpart, the rifle jumps around a lot. If you're going to use the G3, attachments that reduce vertical recoil are going to be very useful, though the gun is still going to take you for a ride. However, there's one downside to the G3 that can't be rectified with attachments. It's incredibly long. With a 17-inch barrel and more than 40-inch overall length, the rifle is huge. As a military service weapon, this isn't much of a problem, but police and SWAT teams primarily operate in close quarters, so a long rifle like the G3 just isn't ideal in a law enforcement role. There are some police forces who still use the G3 as a patrol rifle, but they're in the minority. SWAT teams aren't the only ones who operate in close quarters. The British Special Air Service and Special Boat Service are special operations units that spend a lot of time doing close quarters operations. They were interested in the G3, but the length of the weapon would be a problem for the types of operations they conduct. So, they sent out a request looking for someone who could reproduce the G3 in a submachine gun size. Ultimately, the man who took on the task was American gunsmith Bill Fleming. After much work, the gun he came up with was the H&K 51, though interestingly, the rifle was never actually produced by Heckler & Koch, despite the fact that it was never officially adopted by any military British unit. There are stories of SAS and SBS units using the HK-51 in combat. How effective they were is anyone's guess, but it is telling that they weren't used much beyond a few combat operations. Where the HK-51 has gained some popularity is in the American civilian market. Bill Fleming realized that his design could be sold to civilians, and he did. And while it certainly isn't a practical choice for most people, it's certain to turn heads at the range. Looking at the weapon, it appears to be a G3 shrunk down and optimized for CQB. With a collapsing stock and short 8.3-inch barrel, it certainly fits the size requirement of an entry gun. But there are some very noticeable trade-offs compared to its full-size counterparts. The combination of the short barrel and high caliber makes the muzzle flash of the HK-51 ridiculous. The rifle is also perhaps the loudest gun in the entire game. At times, it genuinely hurts to fire, just like the real thing.
Suspects.
But other than these downsides, the HK-51 in Ready or Not has a surprising amount of benefits. Its short length makes it easy to maneuver in close quarters, and the heavy 7.62x51 round will easily put down any threat you see. And despite what you might think, both the real HK-51 and Ready or Not's version have relatively easy to manage recoil. With a suppressor and foregrip, you'll cut down on much of the recoil and sound. In real life, the HK-51 might not be the most practical rifle, but in Ready or Not, the HK-51 has become one of my new favorite weapons. So far, the battle rifles we've talked about come from a bygone era, one where battle lines still existed, and war meant a clearly defined enemy from an identifiable faction. But with the global war on terror commencing in 2001, warfare became much more complicated. No longer was the enemy obvious, but rather, hid among the civilian populace, giving them the element of surprise. If the Americans were to emerge victorious, they would need to be adaptable, and their weapons would need to be just as accommodating. In 2004, the United States Special Operations Command issued a tender for a new rifle. Among other features, it needed to be modular, with the ability to switch between calibers, barrel lengths, and furniture. To create this rifle, the Belgian company Fabrique Nationale was contracted, and thus, the FN SCAR was born. There were two versions of the SCAR, the SCAR Light and SCAR Heavy. The Light is chambered in 5.56, while the Heavy, 7.62x51. Both use the same operating system, the short-stroke gas piston system. This is a reliable system that's easy to maintain. The modularity and reliability of the weapon proved to be attractive benefits. In 2009, a large amount of SCARs was acquired by the 75th Ranger Regiment. By all accounts, the SCAR should have been the future of American special operations. Compared to older battle rifles, the SCAR Heavy is incredibly advanced. It has rails all over to attach anything you want. It's made of a mixture of aluminum and polymer, which makes the SCAR lighter compared to other battle rifles. The rifle also has a folding stock, which allows the SCAR to be easily stored. And despite how light the weapon is, the SCAR Heavy is one of the lightest recoiling battle rifles. The cherry on top is that the SCAR mimics many of the controls of the AR-15 platform, so an operator trained on the AR-15 will have little trouble learning the SCAR. On paper, the SCAR seemed to be the next great rifle, but in practice, the SCAR had issues. One of the most common complaints about the SCAR is the reciprocating charging handle. When firing the weapon, the charging handle cycles back and forth. This handle can get snagged on equipment or the environment, which has the potential to cause a malfunction. It also limits the space where a shooter can place their support hand, since the path of the charging handle cannot be blocked. For some reason, the SCAR Heavy is also known to damage optics, meaning that only the most robust optics will survive being mounted on the rifle. Perhaps due to some of these complaints, SOCOM announced in 2010 that they would no longer be purchasing the 5.56 SCAR Light due to its lack of significant improvement over other 5.56 rifles. But the SCAR Heavy remains in service to this day, with many being used by American special operators in the Middle East. A significant number of militaries around the world still use the SCAR. Most interestingly, the SCAR Heavy has found favor among Ukrainian forces because of its ability to punch through armor. As far as law enforcement use goes, there are some units using the SCAR Heavy, though they're typically limited to special units or sniper roles. In Ready or Not, the SCAR Heavy you have access to is relatively unmodified, except for the rail at the front. One ergonomic complaint about the SCAR is that the handguard is too short, which limits attachment mounting points, and also room for the support hand. So, a company by the name of Primary Weapons Systems designed a rail extension for the SCAR, which is the rail seen here. This allows more room for attachments, and lets a shooter grip the gun closer to the end of the barrel, which makes for a more comfortable shooting position. Just like its real-life counterpart, the SCAR Heavy in Ready or Not is relatively easy to control, and allows for the mounting of any attachment you could want. And just like all the other battle rifles, the 7.62x51 round will have no trouble taking down any threat you run into. Since the controls of the SCAR borrow heavily from AR-15 controls, any reload you need to do will be faster compared to other battle rifles. If you're a tactical hypebeast that needs every new piece of gear in multicam on release and thinks anything more than a sub 3-second reload will get you killed, you'll feel right at home with the SCAR. So, that's all the new battle rifles in Ready or Not. With 5 in total, there's now a good assortment, ranging from old and classic to new and tactical. Pick whichever one you like. My favorite one is the HK51, because of the HK slap and how obnoxious the gun is unsuppressed. But there's one additional gun in the Dark Waters DLC that I haven't talked about yet. One advantage of the 9mm round is that it's relatively quiet compared to rifle rounds. Because of this, the 9mm round is one of the best rounds to use in a suppressed weapon. To that end, in 1974, H&K introduced the MP5 SD variant. This MP5 looks very different, its most unique feature being the integral suppressor. In modern times, suppressed weapons are usually used in conjunction with subsonic ammunition to minimize sound. But in the 1970s, subsonic ammunition was still relatively uncommon. Because of this, the MP5SD is a firearm specifically designed to use regular supersonic 9mm ammunition. Compared to other suppressed weapons, the MP5SD is somewhat unique. The barrel has a number of ports drilled right after the chamber, which allows gas to bleed off into the suppressor. In the suppressor, gas is allowed to further expand and reduce pressure. This combination means that supersonic ammunition fired out of the MP5SD will instead be traveling at subsonic speeds when it leaves the barrel, making for a very quiet weapon. It may seem somewhat unremarkable. To call it simply an MP5 with a built-in suppressor wouldn't be entirely incorrect. But a submachine gun having the ability to fire any type of ammunition at subsonic speeds is a feature rarely seen in modern firearms. In Ready or Not, the MP5SD mimics the quietness of its real-life counterpart quite well. One interesting note about the MP5SD in real life is that it uses a proprietary handguard to accommodate the built-in suppressor. This means that the MP5SD cannot use regular MP5 handguards that have rails for attachments. Many professionals who use the weapon resorted to a variety of different homebrew solutions to mount attachments to their MP5SDs, from tape, zip ties, to hose clamps. Ready or Not pays homage to this attribute of the weapon. When you mount a light, it's attached with a combination of zip ties and rubber bands. In this age of needing every new tactical mount on the market, it's really cool to see such an old method of attachment mounting in a modern game. The MP5SD has always been one of my favorite weapons, and its inclusion in Ready or Not makes me very happy. It may not be the most effective against armored threats, but really, I don't care. It's easily one of my favorite weapons in Ready or Not.
We're going deep, and we're going hard.
Surely you can't be serious.
I'm serious, and don't call me Shirley.
I'll get it. Down on your goddamn...
So, that's all the new weapons that have been brought in with Dark Waters. But, knowing your weapons is only half the battle. If you want to succeed, you'll need to understand the maps, suspects, and other threats you may face. To learn more, check out this video on the Shane No One Cares channel, where he goes into detail about the lore, background information on the suspects, and more. And thank you for watching.